Welcome to the deep dive. We are really glad you're here with us today because we're exploring a premise that honestly, it feels like it belongs in some blockbuster mystery
Yeah,
novel.
it really does, yeah.
But it's not fiction. We're going to be looking at a very real, very intense analysis of what is arguably the most printed, most distributed, and most influential book in human history.
The King James Bible.
Exactly.
Huh.
But we aren't looking at it the way you might in a theology class or a history seminar. We are looking at it purely through the lens of mathematics.
Right, which is completely wild.
It is. The core question on the table today is this. What if this ancient text, translated over 4 centuries ago, contains a hidden, incredibly precise mathematical signature?
It's a premise that completely short-circuits how we typically think about literature, and particularly translation. I mean, when you or I sit down with a book, we're looking at sentences, narratives, poetry, historical accounts.
You aren't usually counting the exact number of times a specific vowel appears.
No,
Hmm.
definitely not. Or running algorithmic equations on the placement of certain nouns. But the source material we're digging into today does exactly that. And the sheer volume of data it presents to back up its claims is, quite frankly, staggering.
Today's source material is a fascinating book called Sealed by the King by Brandon Peterson. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore Peterson's central claim.
Which is that the text of the King James Bible, specifically the 1611 English translation and its subsequent standardizations, is intricately woven with numerical patterns.
Right. And these patterns aren't just a random assortment of numbers. They overwhelmingly orbit around one specific digit, the number 7.
Yep.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to lay out the core focus of our conversation today. Are these patterns mathematically significant? When we look at the immense density of these numbers, could the staggering level of detail simply be a random coincidence, like an artifact of probability?
Or, as the author argues, is it undeniable proof of divine inspiration, demonstrating that a supreme architect actually preserved this text down to the very letter.
Those are massive questions.
They are the exact right questions to anchor us today. Now, to set the stage here, we really need to acknowledge something fundamental about human psychology.
You're pattern-seeking creatures.
Exactly. Humans are naturally pattern-seeking creatures. We look at clouds and we see faces. We look at random disconnected events, and our brains try to weave a narrative or, find a conspiracy.
It's how our neurological systems are wired to survive, to make sense of a chaotic universe.
Right. So skepticism is a very healthy, very natural starting point for this kind of material.
Oh, absolutely.
But what we are going to discuss today goes far, far beyond simple wordplay or confirmation bias. The scale of the patterns Peterson has documented challenges our fundamental understanding of how language operates, how mathematics functions, and how a text translated by a committee of fallible humans in the 17th century could possibly maintain this level of structural rigidity across time.
I want to make sure we keep that healthy skepticism at the forefront today, though. So let's start at the very foundation of Peterson's entire study, the architecture of the number 7.
Okay.
According to the source, numbers are considered by the author to be a type of God.
A type E of God.
Right. The reasoning here is that numbers possess qualities that are often attributed to the divine. They are infinite. You can never run out of numbers. You can always add one more.
And they never change. The concept of a 2 or a 5 is the exact same today as it was 10,000 years ago.
Right. They are an absolute constant in a universe full of variables.
The author builds on the theological concept that if God is infinite and unchanging, mathematics is a natural reflection of that nature. It's a universal language. And within that mathematical framework, the number 7 holds a paramount, undisputed position in the biblical text.
Right. Historically and theologically, 7 represents rest. It represents an ending, completion, and ultimately perfection.
The most famous example that everyone knows, even if they never cracked open a Bible in their life, is the creation narrative.
God creates the heavens and the earth and then rests on the 7th day.
Exactly. But Peterson takes this surface-level thematic use of 7 and looks at the literal, microscopic structure of the text itself. For example, he looks at the word Sabbath, which refers to that 7th day of rest.
Okay.
If you search for that specific word, it is mentioned exactly 77 times in the Old Testament.
77 times.
Right. And here is where the structural placement comes in. The 77th mention of Sabbath is the very last time it's used in the Old Testament.
Which makes the next mention the very first time it appears in the New Testament.
Yes. It is essentially acting as a mathematical bridge between the two major sections of the book.
And this brings up an interesting piece of context about the author himself, Brandon Peterson. He notes in the preface that he wasn't always searching for esoteric mathematical codes.
No. In fact, for years, he was a self-described non-reader of the Bible.
He transitioned from being completely biblically illiterate to becoming a massive enthusiast of the King James Version specifically. And this shift was driven by what he describes as finding these glorious pearls.
He didn't start with a mathematical hypothesis that he was trying to prove. He started by reading, feeling a connection to the text, and then, after hearing about numeric patterns in the original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, he wondered if those same patterns existed in the translated English version he was holding in his hands.
Which is a bold leap to make, because translating a text usually destroys any structural math.
Usually, yes.
But the patterns he claims to have found are incredibly intricate. Let's talk about why 7 acts as this ultimate seal. Peterson asks a brilliant rhetorical question.
If an omnipotent, infinite creator were to essentially sign a book to authenticate it across centuries, what number would pass as that seal?
And the source claims God used the number 7 to authenticate the King James Bible. And the examples Peterson provides are incredibly specific. Let's look at the word love. In the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the word love spelled with a lowercase l appears exactly 49 times.
That is, of course, 7 times 7.
Right.
It's a striking detail, and we really need to pause and think about the parameters of that. It's not just the word love overall. It is specifically the lowercase version.
Right, meaning the capitalization choices of the translators play a direct role in whether or not this mathematical equation works out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop with thematic words. It applies to titles of the divine as well. According to the source, the title Most High is mentioned exactly 49 times across the text.
Again, 7 times 7.
Or consider the very first recorded sentence spoken by Jesus in the chronological narrative of the text. This is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 49, when Jesus is 12 years old.
Okay, so in the King James translation, that first spoken sentence is exactly 7 words long.
Yes, and if you count the individual letters in those 7 words, there are exactly 21 letters.
21 is 7 plus 7 plus 7?
Exactly.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Finding a 7-word sentence with 21 letters is cool. But you have to wonder, if you run enough searches on a text of over 700,000 words, aren't you bound to find sentences that happen to perfectly align with multiples of 7?
Sure.
How does Peterson argue that this isn't just a statistical inevitability?
That is the crucial counterargument. Is this the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you fire a bunch of random shots at the side of a barn and then draw a bullseye around a cluster of bullet holes to make it look like you have perfect aim?
Right.
Peterson's defense against that is the placement and the significance of where these numbers occur. He argues it isn't just any random sentence. It is the very first sentence spoken by the central figure of the entire text.
Okay.
It's the clustering of the thematic importance with the mathematical precision. I want you, the listener, to just imagine this from a logistical standpoint. Imagine you are sitting down to write a massive, multi-generational epic, and you decide that you're going to intentionally place specific thematic words, like love, so they appear exactly at multiples of 7. But you also have to make sure you never accidentally start a sentence with the word love, because that would capitalize it and throw off the lowercase count.
Oh, man.
You also want specific titles to appear exactly 49 times. And you want your protagonist's first line of dialogue to be exactly 7 words and 21 letters.
It would be a nightmare. You'd spend more time counting than writing.
Precisely. Doing that as a single author with a modern word processor, where you can instantly hit Control F to check your word counts, would severely constrain your ability to write natural-sounding prose.
Right.
Now, imagine trying to execute that exact same mathematical perfection, not as a single author, but as a committee of 47 different scholars and translators.
Working by candlelight.
Working by candlelight in the year 1611. Translating from ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into early modern English. The sheer statistical improbability of a committee achieving this level of cross-reference mathematical integration by accident is what Peterson points to as evidence of a higher design.
And we are really just skimming the surface here. Let's move to what the author calls the alpha, the omega, and the first and last bookends.
This part of the source material gets intensely structural. because it deals with the absolute extremities of the Bible.
We're talking about the very first verse, Genesis 1.1, and the very last verse, Revelation 22.21.
Yes, Peterson brings up this astonishing symmetry between these two distinct verses. If you go to the very beginning of the Bible and you count to the seventh word, that word is heaven.
Okay.
If you go to the very end of the Bible and you count backwards to the seventh word from the end, that word is Jesus.
What's fascinating here is how Peterson claims the text mathematically links these two bookend concepts together. He doesn't just stop at identifying heaven and Jesus as the seventh words.
No, he runs a specific contextual search. He looks for every single time the word heaven and the word Jesus appear in the exact same verse anywhere in the entire biblical text.
And when he runs that search, heaven appears in this shared context exactly 26 times.
Right.
Jesus appears in this shared context exactly 23 times. When you combine those mentions, 26 plus 23, the total is exactly 49.
7 times 7.
So the exact two words that occupy the seventh positions at the dawn and the twilight of the text interact with each other in the body of the text exactly 49 times.
It's like the text is a massive puzzle folding in on itself.
But again, a skeptic might say, well, heaven and Jesus are incredibly common words in the Bible. Of course they intersect.
But the source anticipates that and goes deeper.
Yeah.
Peterson looks at the physical, typographical composition of the letters in those first and last verses. He points out what he calls a vowel and consonant anomaly.
Okay, explain that one.
Genesis 1.1 and Revelation 22.21 both contain exactly 17 vowels, and they both contain exactly 27 consonants.
That's a total of 44 letters in each verse.
Exactly. The exact same distribution of vowels and consonants in the very first and very last verses of a massive library of 66 books.
And Peterson doesn't just present the numbers 17 and 27 as a neat piece of typographical trivia. He extrapolates their thematic meaning within the broader biblical narrative.
He asks the analytical question, why 17 and 27? Why not 14 and 21, which would be clean multiples of 7?
Right.
He points out that the very first mention of the number 17 in the Bible occurs in the book of Genesis, and it marks the exact beginning of Noah's flood. The text specifies the flood began on the 17th day of the second month.
Okay.
And the very first mention of the number 27 in the Bible marks the exact end of the flood. The text says the earth was dried on the 27th day of the second month.
Wow. So according to Peterson's framework, the literal vowels and consonants of the first and last verses of the Bible mathematically mirror the chronological beginning and the chronological end of the flood narrative.
Yes, which is a narrative that literally deals with the washing and recreating of the earth, mirroring the creation and the final recreation at the end of Revelation.
That is an incredibly layered connection. You have typographical letter counts matching up with chronological dates of a major narrative event.
And Peterson goes even further with the very first and very last words of the Bible itself. The very first word is in, from the phrase in the beginning. The very last word is omen.
Okay.
Peterson says, let's set a parameter. Let's search for just those two words, in and amen, and amen. But let's only search for them in the first and last books, just Genesis and Revelation.
If you count every single instance of the word in and every single instance of the word amen in those two bookend texts, they appear exactly 777 times combined.
The author argues that this functions exactly like a textual vault. These first and last bookends, the seventh words being heaven and Jesus, the 17 vowels and 27 consonants mirroring the flood dates, the 777 combined mentions of the first and last words, they act as a tamper-evident seal.
They lock the entire narrative in place from front to back.
Exactly. If you are a later editor and you decide to add a word or remove a word or even alter the spelling in a way that changes a single vowel to a consonant, the entire mathematical vault shatters.
Peterson uses this to suggest a level of structural engineering that goes all the way down to the individual characters on the page, arguing that no human committee could foresee all these overlapping parameters.
Well, if the concept of a mathematical vault hasn't made you pause yet, we're about to get into the names of the divine.
Yes, Peterson calls this next anomaly the ultimate coincidence. He refers to it as the God miracle, and it revolves entirely around the number 7,777.
But to understand it, we really need to slow down and explain the methodology, because it is hyper-specific.
It is. This is where the mathematical probability really starts to push the boundaries of what we consider coincidence.
The author looks at the strict capitalization of divine names, and this relies heavily on the specific typographical choices made in the English text. To arrive at this 7,777 number, Peterson sets up three distinct categories or buckets of words to count.
Okay, let's break that 7,777 down into those three distinct buckets. Let's look at bucket one.
Okay.
Peterson takes the sum of all uppercase standard names and titles of God in the Old Testament. We are talking about titles that are fully capitalized. Jehovah, the phrase I am, JH, Lord, and God, every single letter capitalized. So
Sure.
you count all of those up. Got that.
Got it.
Okay, bucket two.
For the second bucket, he moves to the New Testament and adds all uppercase names and titles of Jesus. This includes Jesus when it is fully capitalized, but also prophetic titles like branch and king when they are presented in all caps. You take the total count of bucket one and add the total count of bucket two.
And then for the third bucket, he adds all the remaining standard mentions of the name Jesus in the text, regardless of whether it's all caps or just standard capitalization.
Right.
When you combine those three highly specific data sets together, the exact sum is 7,777.
But the catch here, and it's a massive catch, is that it relies on the absolute microscopic mechanics of the English language, specifically the apostrophe.
The author points out that this pattern only works if you strictly exclude possessive forms. You cannot count the word Jesus's with an apostrophe at the end, or Christ's. You are only counting the direct, non-possessive noun.
The precision required here is what makes the argument for divine preservation so compelling to the author. You have to consider the reality of the translation process.
Right.
The original Hebrew and Greek manuscripts do not use capitalization or punctuation in the same way modern English does. The concept of using all capital letters for emphasis or using an apostrophe to denote possession, those are conventions of the English language.
The decision by the translators to capitalize branch in Zechariah, or the decision of where to place an apostrophe, these were subjective choices made by English translators.
Yet Peterson points out that those specific, fallible human choices result in an exact calculation of 7,777.
And Peterson argues that obscure titles are necessary for this math to work. For instance, in Exodus, God says, "His name is jealous," and it is capitalized.
That highly specific, seemingly random uppercase title is mathematically required to make the final sum perfectly hit 7,777.
If the translators hadn't capitalized jealous, the math fails.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is making a profound claim about the nature of inspiration. He isn't just saying the original thoughts were inspired. He is saying the mechanics of the English translation itself were guided so that the grammar and punctuation perfectly aligned with a mathematical master plan.
Let's look at another example of this with the concept of the Trinity, or the Godhead. The source runs a case-sensitive search for three exact phrases: the Father, the Word, and Holy Ghost.
When you combine the mentions of those exact case-sensitive phrases, it yields exactly 218 mentions.
Furthermore, if you just search for the specific phrase "the Father" as a case-sensitive phrase on its own, it also appears exactly 218 times.
And that number, 218, seems somewhat arbitrary at first glance, right?
Yeah, it's not a 7. It's not a multiple of 7 like 49 or 777.
But Peterson's methodology often involves digging into the text to see if the Bible itself comments on these recurring numbers. He looks to see if the actual number 218 is written out anywhere.
And it turns out the number 218 is mentioned only one single time in the entire biblical text.
It occurs in the book of Ezra, chapter 8, verse 9. The verse is listing a genealogy, and it mentions a man named Joab, stating that he brings with him 218 males.
Okay, so a random genealogy in Ezra mentions 218. Why does that matter?
Because of the linguistic root of the name. Peterson points out that the Hebrew name Joab literally translates to God is the Father.
Wow. Okay, so the exact case-sensitive English phrase "the Father" appears 218 times. The combined Trinity titles appear 218 times. And the one and only time the number 218 is written out in the text, it is tied directly to a man whose historical Hebrew name translates to God is the Father.
That is incredibly dense.
But again, to maintain our impartial view here, we have to ask, is this evidence of a divine code? Or is this a man with a very powerful computer search program looking for any correlation he can find?
Right.
If you look hard enough at any massive data set, will you eventually find numbers that match up with definitions?
That is the fundamental debate at the heart of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
For this specific 218 connection to be a pure coincidence, you have to accept a cascading series of probabilities.
You have to accept that English translators accidentally chose exact phrasings and capitalizations that perfectly matched a numerical value.
Then you have to accept that this specific numerical value only appears once in the text.
And finally, you have to accept that it just happens to perfectly match the translated definition of a Hebrew name from a completely different era of the Old Testament.
Peterson argues that the statistical unlikelihood of this compounding sequence of events is astronomical, pushing it past coincidence into the realm of intentional design.
Speaking of astronomical math, let's look at the actual structural mathematics underlying the text. Peterson doesn't just stick to basic addition and multiplication. He gets into primes and even and odd splits.
Yes, he delves into prime numbers. For a quick refresher, a prime number is a number greater than 1 that is only divisible by 1 and itself. So 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on.
But Peterson also looks at a specialized subset called additive primes.
Right. An additive prime is a prime number where if you take its individual digits and add them together, the resulting sum is also a prime number.
Okay, let's clarify that with a tangible example. Let's take the number 23.
Perfect. 23 is a prime number because nothing divides into it evenly except 1 and 23. Now, if you take the individual digits of 23, the 2 and the 3, and you add them together, you get 5.
And 5 is also a prime number.
Therefore, because both the base number and the sum of its digits are prime, the number 23 is classified mathematically as an additive prime.
Got it. So Peterson takes this mathematical concept and applies it to the historical timeline of the King James Bible. Specifically, he looks at its publication year, 1611.
He asks you a purely mathematical question. What is the 1611th prime number in existence?
If you sit down and list out every single prime number in numerical order, the 1611th one on the list is 13,627.
Now let's apply the additive prime test to that number. Let's look at the digits of 13,627. 1, 3, 6, 2, and 7.
If you add those up, 1 plus 3 plus 6 plus 2 plus 7, the sum is 19.
19 is a prime number. That means the 1611th prime number is also an additive prime.
And Peterson shows that the math goes one step further into the pattern of sevens. If you filter out all regular primes and you list out only the additive primes in numerical order, the number 13,627 happens to be exactly the 777th additive prime on the list.
So the year the King James Bible was printed, 1611, is mathematically intrinsically locked to the divine signature number 777.
And what's crucial to understand here is that this is a relationship that exists in the absolute laws of mathematics. It is completely independent of human language. It's independent of translation. And it's independent of human history.
It is a mathematical absolute.
But the author asserts that the text of the Bible does reflect this absolute math. Peterson reveals that if you count every single word and phrase sequentially from the beginning of the King James Bible, the 13,627th word is found in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verse 16.
And that specific word is the very first time in the entire Bible that God says the word sworn, as in swearing an oath.
So according to the source, you have the mathematical perfection of the year 1611 and the signature number 777 intersecting at the exact physical word where God makes a sworn oath to humanity.
For Peterson, it elevates the math from merely structural to deeply theological. He sees the math as underscoring the spiritual weight of the text. And we see this structural approach again in how the source analyzes the layout of the books themselves.
Let's look at the New Testament, which consists of exactly 27 books.
Peterson splits these 27 books into two categories. Odd-numbered books, so the first book, the third book, the fifth book, and so on, and even-numbered books. He then counts the mentions of the name Jesus.
In the odd-numbered books of the New Testament, the name Jesus is mentioned exactly 490 times.
And 490 is exactly 70 times 7.
Which is a number with massive biblical significance on its own.
Right, but then he runs the exact same count on the even-numbered books. Now you have to remember, there is a vastly different number of chapters, verses, and overall words between the odd books and the even books. They are not symmetrical in length.
Yet, despite that disparity, the name Jesus is mentioned exactly 490 times in the even-numbered books as well.
Another 70 times 7. The exact same highly significant multiple of 7 is perfectly balanced across the odd and even divides of the New Testament.
And the author points out a fascinating textual threshold where this mathematical division occurs. He looks at the word Moses, which theologically represents the Old Law.
The word Moses appears exactly 77 times in the New Testament.
Peterson sees this as acting as a numerical mirror to a specific verse in John 1:17, which says, "For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ."
The argument here is that the math isn't just blindly counting words for the sake of generating data. The math is actually reflecting the core theology of the text. The 77 of Moses balances against the 490 of Jesus.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Peterson's argument is that the text is acting almost as a cohesive, self-aware organism. The mathematical structure is actively reinforcing the spiritual message.
It is a level of integrated design that, if intentional, completely redefines how we assume ancient texts were compiled and translated.
Which brings us to another major leap in Peterson's methodology, alphanumerics, specifically gematria, and how it connects to physical constants. We are moving from simply counting words into a practice where numerical values are assigned to the letters of the alphabet themselves.
The source uses two primary systems. The first is English ordinal. This is the simplest form, where A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, all the way down the alphabet to Z being 26.
The second system Peterson uses is called English Standard.
Let's clarify how English Standard works, because it's different from the simple 1 through 26 of ordinal. In the English Standard system, the values scale up exponentially to accommodate much larger mathematical counts.
Right.
While the exact numbering tables can get complex, the basic idea is that instead of stopping at 26, the letters eventually represent values in the tens and hundreds. This allows a single word to have a much larger numerical weight.
Okay, so using these alphanumeric systems, Peterson calculates the English ordinal value, the simple A equals 1, B equals 2 system of the very first verse of the Old Testament, Genesis 1.1.
He calculates the value of every letter in that verse, and the total ordinal value is 411.
Then he does the same thing for the first verse of the New Testament, Matthew 1.1. The ordinal value of that verse is 698. Let me just mentally write this down. Genesis 1.1 is 411. Matthew 1.1 is 698.
When you add those two values together, the sum is exactly 11,109.
That number, 11,109, becomes a central pillar in Peterson's alphanumeric argument, because he then switches over to the English Standard System, the one with the exponentially larger values.
He calculates the English Standard value of the exact phrase, Lord Jesus Christ.
When you run that phrase through the standard cipher, the value is exactly 1109.
The mathematical sum of the opening verses of both testaments is perfectly equal to the value of the full title of the central figure of the text.
And according to the source, the math loops back on itself again. If you look closely at Matthew 1.1, there are 7 key nouns used in that opening verse: book, generation, Jesus Christ's son, David, and Abraham.
Peterson takes those 7 exact key words and searches for them across the 4 Gospels. The total number of times those 7 words appear is exactly 11,109 mentions.
The math is cross-referencing itself across different systems of calculation, from ordinal to standard to basic word counts.
And this is where Peterson introduces a concept that bridges theology with quantum physics.
This part is wild.
It is. He brings up the fine structure constant. In physics, this constant dictates the strength of the electromagnetic interaction between elementary charged particles.
To put it simply, it is essentially the magic number that allows electrons to stay in orbit around a nucleus. It is the number that allows atoms to exist, which allows matter to form, which allows life to exist in our universe.
The value of this constant is famously approximated as 1 over 137. In physics equations, scientists represent this constant using the Greek letter alpha, which translates to the English letter A.
And here's the theological connection. Jesus explicitly refers to himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So Peterson looks at the very first phrase of the Bible, in the beginning.
If you calculate the English ordinal value of that exact phrase, in the beginning the value is exactly 137.
This raises an important question, and Peterson frames it beautifully by quoting the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins.
Dawkins, who is a famous and vocal atheist, once conceded in a discussion that if an intelligent designer existed, you might find a signature of that designer if you look deep enough into the microscopic details of biochemistry or molecular biology.
Peterson takes Dawkins' premise and shifts the domain entirely. He argues that God placed his signature not just in the biological fabric of DNA, but in the numerical fabric of his translated word.
The claim is that the text itself contains the exact physical constant that governs the creation of the universe.
That is a profound paradigm-shifting idea. It's the idea that the underlying code of reality is embedded in the grammar of the text. And we see this kind of hyper-specific numbering play out in the actual narrative events as well.
Let's look at the mystery of the 153 fishes.
This is a famous story in the Gospel of John, chapter 21. The disciples have been fishing all night and caught nothing. Jesus tells them to cast their net on the right side of the ship, and they catch a net full of large fish.
And the text goes out of its way to specify exactly how many fish there were, 153.
Why that highly specific number? Theologians and scholars have debated this for centuries, looking for symbolic meanings. But Peterson looks at the mathematical structure of the rest of the text for the answer.
He discovers a fascinating correlation. He looks at the names of the two most prominent apostles in the New Testament, Peter and Paul. He counts how many verses contain their names.
The name Peter appears in exactly 153 verses throughout the Bible.
The name Paul also appears in exactly 153 verses. So the two main figures of the early church are mathematically tied to the number of the miraculous catch of fish.
And Peterson argues that the connection between these two men and that specific number is explicitly encoded later in the book of Galatians. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, the Apostle Paul is describing the history of his ministry and the moment he first went to meet Peter.
Paul writes that he went up to Jerusalem after 3 years, and he states that he stayed with Peter for 15 days.
15 and 3. 1, 5, 3. 1, 5, 3. The exact digits of the fish are sequentially embedded in the very verse where the two men, who each appear 153 times, finally meet face to face.
It's like finding complex Easter eggs hidden in a video game code. But the code is a 400-year-old holy text.
But listen, as much as we've explored these incredible claims, we have to address the elephant in the room. And it's a massive one that any critical historian or linguist would point out immediately.
Everything we've talked about so far is incredibly compelling.
Yeah.
But there is a major historical flaw.
Many of these mathematical patterns, especially the ones relying on exact letter counts or specific vowels and consonants, didn't actually exist in the original 1611 printing of the King James Bible.
Yes, this is a crucial counterpoint. And to his credit, Peterson addresses it head-on in the source material. The reality is that English spelling in 1611 was incredibly fluid. It was not standardized at all.
For example, we talked earlier about the seventh word from the beginning of Genesis being heaven, and the seventh from the end being Jesus. Well, in the original 1611 printing, heaven was spelled H-E-A-U-E-N.
And Jesus was spelled I-E-S-U-S.
Therefore, that elegant 17-vowel and 27-consonant pattern that perfectly mirrored the flood narrative, that didn't actually lock into place in 1611.
It only finalized when the spellings were officially standardized in subsequent historical editions. Specifically, the revisions around 1629 and the major Oxford standardization of 1769.
So how does Peterson possibly reconcile this? If the math wasn't perfect in the original 1611 translation, doesn't that completely debunk the entire theory of divine design? Doesn't it prove that these patterns are just the result of modern spellings accidentally creating a retroactive code?
You would think so, but the author views this historical reality not as a flaw in the theory, but as evidence of a theological concept called progressive perfection.
Peterson argues vehemently against the idea of double inspiration, which is the belief that God inspired the original Hebrew and Greek writers and then flawlessly inspired the 1611 English translators in a single lightning bolt flash of perfection.
Instead, he points to the text itself for an explanation. He quotes the book of Psalms, chapter 12, verse 6, which says, "The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times."
Peterson believes this verse is a literal description of the process of the English Bible. He argues that God actively guided the messy, drawn-out human process of standardizing English spelling over the course of 150 years, specifically to finalize, refine, and purify these mathematical miracles into their final form by 1769.
So he's arguing that the natural evolution and standardization of the entire English language itself was being subtly steered to make a code work in one specific book.
That is a massive claim.
This raises an important question, and it is the crux of the entire debate surrounding this book. Does the messy human process of historical linguistic standardization disprove the miracle? Or does the fact that standardized spelling accidentally created flawless mathematical patterns across the entire text make it even more miraculous?
Let's look at the variables. You have 47 translators in 1611 making foundational choices about phrasing and vocabulary. Then, you have multiple generations of independent printers, editors, and linguists over the next century and a half, slowly altering spelling conventions.
Changing U's to V's, swapping I's to J's, standardizing silent E's.
Peterson asks the reader, did all of those independent human actors spread across centuries somehow blindly coordinate their linguistic drift to ensure that the final word counts, the vowel counts, and the intricate gematria of values of the text perfectly locked into multiples of 7?
Right. I mean, think about the logistics of that. Could those original 47 translators in 1611 have possibly planned for how English spelling would evolve by 1769 to ensure the math eventually worked out?
It seems impossible. You, the listener, are being asked to weigh the evidence here based on Peterson's methodology. You really have to decide which scenario requires more faith to believe.
Believing that an infinite God subtly guided the evolution of a global language to mathematically sign his book, or believing that thousands of random, uncoordinated linguistic mutations perfectly collided over centuries to accidentally create mathematical equations involving prime numbers, physical constants, and perfectly balanced cross-references.
It is a phenomenal thought experiment. The source material is absolutely adamant that random chance cannot account for this level of structural integrity.
Peterson is presenting a case that the text is not a static historical relic, but a mathematically living document that matured into its final perfect form, precisely when the English language itself matured. He views the history not as a debunking, but as the mechanism of the miracle.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. So what does this all mean?
We've looked at the number 7 representing divine perfection and completion. We've seen 7777s acting as textual vaults, tying together the beginning and the end of the text.
We've looked at the 1109 gematria codes mathematically matching up the opening verses of the Old and New Testaments with the title of Jesus. We've seen additive primes pointing directly to the year 1611 and the physical constants of the universe buried in the ordinal values of the text.
We've tracked the exact numbering of the 153 fishes to the appearances of Peter and Paul, and we've explored the controversial idea that the historical standardization of the English language was a divinely guided, refining process.
For you, the listener, regardless of your personal theological background, whether you are a devout believer or staunch skeptic, the sheer mathematical density of this text, as presented by Peterson, is an objective marvel to consider.
The data compiled and sealed by the king forces us to ask very deep, uncomfortable questions about the intersection of human language, statistical probability, and perhaps the divine.
If nothing else, this deep dive proves that the King James Bible contains a structural complexity that defies simple, dismissive explanations. It operates on a mathematical level that we are only just beginning to map using modern computational search tools. It challenges us to look closer at the things we think we already understand.
It's credible. It really makes you reconsider the fabric of the books we read.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Something that builds on everything we've discussed today but pushes it just a little further.
We've spent this entire deep dive talking about mathematics hiding inside a language, almost like a secret code buried beneath the words.
But what if our fundamental assumption is backwards? What if language itself is a mathematical construct? We know from physics and astronomy that our entire universe is built on strict, unbreakable mathematical laws. Gravity, electromagnetism, orbits, they are all math.
If there is a supreme architect who designed the universe using math as the building blocks, wouldn't any authentic message from that architect naturally, inherently take the form of an unbreakable mathematical code?
Perhaps the math we've discussed today isn't just a signature stamped on the book. Perhaps the math is the native tongue of the author.
That is a staggering perspective to consider. If math is the native tongue of creation, it completely changes how you view every single word you read and every pattern you see in the world.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating claims of Sealed by the King. We encourage you to keep questioning assumptions, keep learning about the complexities of history, and keep looking for the patterns in the world around you. You never know what massive truths might be hiding right in front of your eyes, waiting for you to do the math.